Yeah.
So, welcome everyone. My name is Henry Hale. I'm director of our Institute for European Russian Eurasian Studies and also director of our Petrov program on Ukraine. And today we are very pleased to be able to have a conversation with the author of this terrific book, Putin's Revenge. And so the author, of course, is Lucian Kim, who I know is well known to many of you. And he currently is a Ukraine analyst at the International Crisis Group, and he's been reporting on Russia, Ukraine, and related issues for decades. I won't say exactly how long, but I think one of the things you'll find in the book, which is a really well-written, great read, is that it's full of kind of granular, detailed knowledge of the region that comes through spending a lot of time there. And so it's had some very unique experiences, including kind of first-hand reporting on events like the annexation of Crimea and many other things. So I think his book provides a really great, interesting perspective. And so the way we'll proceed will be I'll ask him to lead off just with kind of a basic overview of kind of the main points he's trying to make in the book. And then after that, we'll just open up for conversation. And so we'll have about an hour. And one other thing I just wanted to mention is we have one copy of the book to be raffled off to a student. So Nini, the coordinator of our Petrov program in Ukraine, has some slips of paper. So if you are a student, raise your hand and you can take a piece of paper and be eligible for the raffle. Okay, so I think let's take it away.
Thank you so much, Henry. It's great to see everyone here, especially on a Monday during a very cold snap for Washington, although not if you're used to Eastern European winters, of course. So it's great to see everyone here. It's a very cozy room that you chose. So a little bit on my background. As Henry mentioned, I've been covering Russia and Ukraine, well, I could say since Putin's first term in office. That's when I arrived in Moscow and began working at the Moscow Times as an editor. Then I worked for Bloomberg. And that was my first stint in Moscow. Basically, my career is as a foreign correspondent. I've been based twice in Berlin, or I can say I based myself there. I based myself twice in Berlin and twice in Moscow. The second time I went back to Moscow was, well, actually, exactly 2016, so 8 years ago, when the first Trump administration was coming into office. So that was also an interesting period of time. As far as Ukraine, I first traveled there in the immediate aftermath of the Orange Revolution, which we can discuss a little bit later. That was a monumental event, obviously, for Ukraine. It was a display of Ukrainian civil society and Ukrainian identity coming to the fore. And that was my first experience in Ukraine. And then a lot of the events I describe in the book happened in 2014. Of course, there were three key events in 2014 regarding Ukraine. It was the Maidan protest, followed immediately by the seizure and annexation of Crimea by Russian forces, followed immediately by the fomenting of pro-Russian insurgency in eastern Ukraine. So I covered all of those events as a journalist and saw a lot of this firsthand. I also, during this time, of course, made friends in Ukraine, and I think that kind of takes us to the story behind the book. In 2021, I moved from Moscow back to the U.S. after really an absence of more than 20 years. I came here with my family. I had a fellowship at the Wilson Center here in Washington, and I had a book idea of what I wanted to work on. A few months later, full-scale invasion begins, and I realized I can't be writing some kind of memoir. It's somehow inappropriate, and I was having conversations with Ukrainian friends who are on the ground, who are living in Kiev and literally running from the Russian invaders. And I remember a conversation I had with one of my friends she said to me, a Ukrainian friend, she said, look, I said, I'm sorry, I can't help you. I'm in Washington in the safety of Georgetown. And she said, well, you know, this is now time for you to step up. You can tell our story. You know what happened. And I realized my contribution as someone who found himself in Washington on a fellowship was to write a book on how it started. Already then, I knew that there were going to be a lot of discussions about why Putin took this fateful decision to invade Ukraine. And we see it to this day. There are a lot of narratives out there put out by the Kremlin, but of course there are also all sorts of narratives circulating in the West. And so, as someone who had actually experienced a lot of these events, I decided that I could tell the story as I saw it, and that was my goal. My intention was not to come at this book with any kind of agenda or preconceived notion, but simply to make an attempt at an honest history of what happened. So I identify two main drivers for the war. The first driver, it has to be said, is the legacy of Russian imperialism. This idea in Russia that Russia should be, or Russia's mission is to be at the core of a large Eurasian empire. And this has kind of been an idea that was behind the Russian Empire. It didn't really change during the Soviet times. And it was sort of the driving force behind the decision that, for a full-scale invasion, that Ukraine's place is in Russia's sphere of influence and not as under any other going its own way. However, I think there was a second driver, and I think this was also important. It's Putin's increasing autocracy. I think it wouldn't have been possible without Putin hanging on to power longer and longer, and in this time, seeing more and more enemies. Putin, beginning already with the Orange Revolution that I mentioned in 2004, already decided that the Orange Revolution was a sort of a Western plot to begin this sort of reverse domino, fall of dominoes towards Russia's border. And the longer he stayed in power, the more paranoid he became about losing the power. And I believe in 2022, for a number of factors which I go into in detail in the book, he realized that this was maybe his last chance to finally go down in history, not as the Russian ruler who lost Ukraine, but the one who reconquered Ukraine. I also discuss the role of the West, because we often hear a lot of people say, well, it was obviously NATO which provoked this war. It was the U.S. which was driving. This is similar to the Kremlin narrative, although you hear plenty of people in the West also offering this explanation. I think we even heard Donald Trump say it last week, that he has understanding for Russian feelings because of Joe Biden's supposed support for Ukraine's NATO membership. So I want to investigate that too. As someone who was on the ground and reporting on these things, I put it on silence. It's my teacher. Can you call Monica, please?
Family first.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's emergency override, so something's going on with my son. Sorry about that.
Oh.
So I wanted to address the idea that you know, what was it that what NATO was doing? What was it the United States was doing? I devote an entire chapter just to U.S. actions at the time. And to make a long story short, the conclusion I conclude, of course the West made a lot of mistakes. And I would think probably the main mistake that the West made was George W. Bush's promise, his drive and promise to Ukraine and Georgia that they would become NATO members. Why was this such a mistake? Because NATO had no intention of letting in Ukraine. but they opened the door with no intention of letting them in. So this created a lot of hopes within Ukraine, and I devote a chapter to Georgia. Both of these countries obviously had their hopes lifted by this push by George W. Bush, although it wasn't really a sincere effort. So I think that was a mistake, and I think the tragedy here is that, well, and I should add, at the same time, it inflamed feelings in the Kremlin. It sort of it proved to the Russian leadership that this was all along some idea, some Western plot to get Ukraine into NATO. I mean, the fact of the matter is, a large majority of the population in Ukraine was not really interested in NATO. There were Ukrainians, until very recently, had quite warm feelings towards Russia, if we are to believe opinion polls. And so this was, these were of course, this was of course also a major factor. The tragedy for Ukraine is that after George W. Bush, no American president cared about Ukraine. I mean, at all. And not to mention Ukraine in NATO. And I'm talking about Barack Obama, I'm talking about Donald Trump, and I'm talking about Joe Biden at the beginning of his administration. In fact, all of these presidents saw it as their duty to reach an accommodation with Putin. I don't know if you have to call it appeasement, but the idea was, from their point of view, Russia is a nuclear power. We need to reach some kind of relationship and some kind of modus vivendi. Each president had their own idea about it, but that we need to reach a modus vivendi with Russia. And what happens with Ukraine? Well, whatever. There was no drive to get Ukraine into NATO once George W. Bush was on the scene. And that applies also to Joe Biden, who was then, when he came into office, Volodymyr Zelensky was desperate to meet with Joe Biden, and Joe Biden blew him off. He was interested in meeting Putin. They had their Geneva summit in June 2021. The priorities of the Biden administration for relations with Russia, when Biden came into office, that's exactly 4 years ago, were Russian cyber attacks, Russian bounties on U.S. soldiers in Afghanistan, and the treatment of Alexei Navalny. Not Ukraine. Ukraine wasn't on there. Among these priorities in relations with Russia. So it was actually the fact that the U.S. After George Bush was ignoring for a large part Ukraine and making Ukraine secondary to relations with Russia. You know, the logic behind that I think is understandable. I don't think I try to make any judgment on that, but that's the way it was. Those are the sort of the main themes in the book. As I mentioned, the book starts with the Orange Revolution. I chose this moment because, for one, it was also a time when people outside of Ukraine noticed the country for the first time. Ukraine, up to that point, often people still called it the Ukraine, reflecting Ukraine's role in people's imagination for centuries, that it was really just an appendage of Russia. And I think during the Orange Revolution, people realized that there is actually a country called Ukraine. There are people called Ukrainians. They have their own sense of agency and their own idea about the future. And I think this was an opening moment also for Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin had been in power for about 4 or 5 years. He had invested a lot in the leading up to the Orange Revolution in the Kremlin's candidate, Viktor Yanukovych, and it was probably the first real foreign policy defeat for Vladimir Putin, and he took away very big lessons from the Orange Revolution. So the book has 11 chapters. It begins with the Orange Revolution. Also, I try to insert in all of the chapters a little bit of my own eyewitness reporting, what I saw. I don't try to make the book about myself. My aspiration is really, truly to write a history. The second chapter then looks at events in Georgia and looks at the NATO summit in 2008, this really crucial moment when the Bush administration was really pushing to give roadmaps to Georgia and Ukraine how they would join NATO. And I explore also the very curious relationship between George Bush and Vladimir Putin, because on one hand, Putin approached Bush at the beginning of his term, well, I would say almost with an olive branch. Of course, there's a famous story that after 9/11, Vladimir Putin was the first world leader to reach out to George Bush, and really he pledged Russian assistance, whatever you need, we're going to help. And the Russians, of course, had a lot to offer. One of the main forms of assistance was, of course, overflight rights to U.S. planes so that they could fly over Russian territory, over Central Asian territory, to supply the war effort in Afghanistan. And so I explored that relationship because on one hand it was a very warm relationship. George Bush met Vladimir Putin something like 40 times during his administration. He visited Russia more than any other country. And so on one hand, it was a very, you had a, they liked to refer to each other immediately after this controversial NATO summit. George Bush actually flew to Sochi to meet with Putin for his last visit. You had a very warm relationship on one level, and at the same time you had unraveling bilateral relations, which kind of culminated with the Russian invasion of Georgia in August 2008. And George Bush was a lame duck. There was nothing that he could do, and despite his very muscular, aggressive foreign policy, when it came to Georgia, the Americans sent, they helped bring some Georgian soldiers in Afghanistan and Iraq back to Georgia, and there were some shipments of humanitarian aid, but that was the extent of the U.S. assistance. So that is chapter 2. Then chapter 3, I go to Russia, because one of the main points in my book is really to explore events also in Russia. We cannot just look at what was happening in Ukraine. We also have to see domestically what was happening in Russia. And the third chapter focuses on the rise of Alexei Navalny as a protest leader during the protests of the winter of 2011-2012. Probably the most fragile time for Vladimir Putin. He was contemplating, or already trying to begin his unprecedented third term in office. And this was a time of great unrest inside Russia, and a moment, it was really a crossroads in which direction the country took. And of course Putin won the election against a bunch of straw men. And we know that, of course, he then hardened his regime because, again, he saw the protests in Moscow as part of an American conspiracy that started with the Orange Revolution, and then it continued on the streets of Moscow. So I could probably go through every chapter, but then the middle 3 chapters I deal with events in Ukraine, and I really try to explore this idea. Whenever we hear Russian officials talk about Ukraine, they always start with one point. They say it all started with the anti-constitutional coup in 2014 in Ukraine, supported by the West. This is sort of, no matter who you're listening to, this is always sort of the origin story. And I try to take apart also what actually happened in 2014. Was it an anti-constitutional coup? Why did Viktor Yanukovych run away? Was he chased away? Was his life in danger? And so I try to explore this also, and I mean the conclusion I reach is that yes, Viktor Yanukovych left Kiev. He was scared. He left on his own volition. He thought he was still in charge, but then he was at that point, once he left Kiev and went to eastern Ukraine, he realized he had no support anywhere. He didn't have support in eastern Ukraine, which was his power base. He didn't have any support even in Crimea when he arrived in Crimea. And in effect, Putin revealed in a propaganda film, which he made a year afterwards, that the Russians helped, in quotes, evacuate Viktor Yanukovych. I see it almost as a kidnapping. They had to extract Viktor Yanukovych because Viktor Yanukovych was already disturbing the Russian plan. There was a plan in place to seize Crimea. And they needed Viktor Yanukovych out of the country, but still recognized as president for two reasons. First of all, they needed Viktor Yanukovych to sign off on the change in government in Crimea, and then they needed him to sign a piece of paper saying that Ukraine was requesting Russian troops to intervene. Two things which happened. We don't know how much Viktor Yanukovych actually knew what he was doing at that point, because he was more or less a hostage. So in that sense, I tried to look at, how did it start? How did the events start on the Maidan and in Crimea? The way the Kremlin portrays what happened in Crimea is that Russia had to intervene because Crimeans, who were very friendly to Russia, and also there were plenty of pro-Russian Crimeans, that they were subject to some kind of reprisals after the Maidan revolution, and that the neo-Nazi Ukrainian nationalists would come by the train and busload and beat people up. This was, in essence, he was echoing a little bit the rhetoric that happened before the NATO intervention in Kosovo, that they were preventing ethnic cleansing. And so he borrowed that narrative. And I tried to look at what was the mood like in Crimea. I was in Crimea at the time. And again, how much preparation was there really? And we know that the Kremlin was deeply involved in laying the groundwork for the Crimean annexation months before there was any real bloodshed on the Maidan. So again, what I discovered was that this was this was not some spontaneous charitable action to save Crimeans. And finally, the last chapter of the section on 2014 is on what happened, on events in the Donbass, in eastern Ukraine, and we can discuss this in greater detail. Then I devote an entire chapter to, as I mentioned before, what the Americans were doing. The Obama administration was caught completely flat-footed. Ukraine was not on their radar at all. The Maidan protest just came out of the blue to them, and I tried to show that in fact the U.S. And under all the presidents, not only Obama, but Trump following him and Biden, there was this effort to refocus U.S. foreign policy on China, and maybe withdrawing from the Middle East, and again, Russia, sort of reaching a modus vivendi with Russia so that Russia couldn't be a spoiler in those plans. That's chapter 7. Then I devote one chapter just to Russian nationalism and what Russian nationalism means for different people. I go back and look at Alexei Navalny, because Alexei Navalny, as many of you might know, actually describes himself as a Russian nationalist. So I tried to explore what does Russian nationalism actually mean. There are different kinds of Russian nationalism, and where does Alexei Navalny fit in, and what did Alexei Navalny say about Ukraine. And the final chapters of the book are about Volodymyr Zelensky's amazing rise to power, because he came out of the blue. People might remember that he was the comedian before that, and his disappointment with Russia, because he did really think he could end this low-level war in eastern Ukraine, and so I look at what were his efforts. I do look at also his relationship with Donald Trump, which was rather unfortunate, and I hope does not give us clues about what is about to happen. And the last two chapters of my book are focus on events in Russia, what led ultimately then for Vladimir Putin to decide to invade on February 24th, 2022. So that's a brief synopsis. I hope it was brief.
Yeah, no, terrific, great, thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot to talk about. The book is really rich in that way. Maybe I'll just start with the first question, which is about, well, first of all, the choice of the title, right? Putin's Revenge. You talk about that decision a little bit in the book to emphasize Putin, and the book talks about how the war in some ways is personal for Putin, which is very interesting. And I'm just interested in, there's some analysts that would say that we shouldn't emphasize Putin's role, that in fact this is like just Russia's war, and that really that's what matters, and Putin is kind of an expression of Russia. So I wonder, that has implications, right, including for what we might expect whenever Putin might leave the scene, what kind of behavior you might expect in Russia, although of course the war itself has changed things. But I wonder if you could just maybe discuss just a little bit about that, about kind of the relationship between Putin and Russia. I mean, you mentioned that a bit at the outset of your remarks, but is this mainly Putin's war, or is it at root Russia's war?
This is a great question. So I mean, well, we can deconstruct this two-word title. I also want to just linger briefly on the word revenge, because I think from what I can tell, some people were wondering also what does the word revenge mean, and I think we should recall that revenge doesn't necessarily mean that you did anything bad. Someone can take revenge on you because they're angry with you, they're offended with you, even though you didn't necessarily do anything to deserve it. As far as your question about Putin's revenge, I chose this title because the ultimate decision to invade Ukraine, a full-scale invasion, was not taken by the Russian people. It was taken by one man and a very tiny inner circle of maybe half a dozen people. And so in that sense, it is revenge. It is revenge for slights and humiliation that group of people perceived. I don't think all Russians. I've had a lot of interactions with with Russians. I'm related to Russians, so I don't think that I don't know if this generalization is right. Also, the point I try to make is one of the drivers of the war was Putin's growing autocracy. This war would not have happened in 2014 even. It happened. It was a process that and in some ways a devolution of the events that led to Putin in great isolation to take this fateful decision. I don't think that absolves people involved in this war of any responsibility. Obviously, I also mentioned it in my introduction, obviously millions of Russians supported this war and eagerly went to fight it. And obviously, responsibility rests with those people and their decisions for whatever reason they might have taken them. But ultimately, this was a dictator's decision. This was not a decision I tried to show in this book. This is the idea of Ukraine and Russia fighting each other in some ways. In the current context, might sound a little bit funny, but it's the idea of Canadians and Americans fighting each other. If I had said that a month ago, it might have sounded a little bit different. But it's really there was a very close bond. The feelings were actually very warm when I started moving. When I started traveling to Ukraine, Ukrainians often felt like Russians looked down at them like an older brother, and so there was that kind of tension in the relationship. But some kind of aggression, and I would say on the part of Russians. I mean, Russians might occasionally use a pejorative term for Ukrainians, but in general, I remember I traveled to Kiev a lot. There were dozens of daily flights and trains between Moscow and Kiev. It's hard to recall that there were so many connections between Russia and Ukraine, transportation connections and personal connections. And I remember people were always jealous, like when I said, "Oh, I'm spending the weekend in Kiev." The Russians, I mean, would say, "Oh, you're gonna have such a great time. It's wonderful." So I don't think there was this animosity. I do think what Putin managed to awake with his propaganda was this feeling that of empire, and that this is ours, and that we're about to lose it. And we need to take it back. It's this possessiveness, right? And of course, he could. I think the annexation of Crimea is a very good example, right? The opinion polls show that 80–90% of the Russian population was actually greeted. So I mean, this does show that there was obviously there was a kernel of that Putin struck a note there by making that decision to seize Crimea. But we were not at the point of an invasion. One question that I do not discuss in this book, and which I think is rather intriguing, is if Putin had tried what he did in 2022, if he had tried that in 2014, would he have been successful? And in researching this book, a lot of Ukrainian officials say that in 2014, when the annexation of Crimea was taking place, they were very distracted. Because inside Ukraine, there's a lot of debate. Well, we could have kicked out the Russians out of Crimea. We just needed to send a couple of plane loads of special forces, and we would have solved the problem, and we would have, nipped this in the bud. My understanding is that the Ukrainians didn't really have an army that they could depend on, and from what Ukrainian leaders at the time said, they were afraid that Crimea was just the beginning, and in some ways maybe just offering a pretext for a full-scale invasion, because all around Ukraine's borders in 2014 was a massive Russian army. So the way that Alexander Turchinov, who was the acting president at the time, described it, he said, Crimea was just one of many, many concerns. There were all sorts of pro-Russian protests breaking out all over southern and eastern Ukraine. And there was a fear that, Crimea is just one piece of the puzzle, and that if we all put all our forces in Crimea, then they'll hit us somewhere else. So that's one issue I didn't discuss in the book, but is certainly also intriguing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, great. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions from the floor, and just ask you to identify yourself, please.
Good afternoon, Ariel Cohen, the Atlantic Council. Great book. You poured your experience and a lot of time in it. And I wanted to ask you about something I had concerned and expounded on that in a number of publications. And that is Putin's perception that the West, and specifically the United States, were very weak in 21. You remember the optics of our withdrawal from Kabul. To me, a person of my age, the parallels were with American helicopters lifting from the embassy in Saigon in 75. We abandoned materiel. We abandoned tens of thousands of people who worked for us. I was involved in trying to pull some of them out and couldn't. So that was the perception of weakness. And then the issue of perception of leadership. Putin prides himself on being a recruiter in past life, in the KGB, of working in human intelligence. What do you think were the contributing factors of his perception of Merkel, who was on the way out at the time, of Scholz coming to replace her, of Joe Biden that he went in, met in Geneva in the fall of 21, and we failed to do what we failed to do in 2008 with Georgia. We failed to deter Russia from changing the geopolitical balance of power, first in Georgia and the Caucasus, then in Ukraine and Eastern Europe. And then, if you examine the document that Moscow produced in December, what I call the Putin ultimatum, there were two documents. One vis-a-vis the United States and one vis-a-vis NATO, demanding massive withdrawal of our equipment in the radius of 1,000 clicks at least from the Moscow border. That is an attempt to change the balance of power. This is not about Ukraine. This is not about Russia. This is about changing the balance of power in Europe, in the world, in conjunction with Beijing, where he was in February of 22, just before the invasion, with a 5,000-word eternal friendship memorandum with Xi Jinping. Can you address that, please?
So the appearance of American weakness, it's not something I go into in great detail, but obviously the U.S. did look very weak. and it's something I've been thinking about after the Afghanistan withdrawal. I still think for Putin the idea was Georgia and with Ukraine in 2014 and with Ukraine again in 2022 that ultimately the U.S. Didn't have anything at stake. The U.S. was not ready. Didn't have any skin in the game in the sense that they were not ready to sacrifice their own soldiers and certainly not risk nuclear war. So I think for Putin that was kind of the overriding concern was, of course the worst nightmare would be for the U.S. to somehow get involved in the war, but he also seemed to have sort of this ultimate deterrent at the same time. Like, I know you guys. I mean, the U.S. was signaling this. The Biden administration was signaling this before the war, right? Ukraine, I don't know what it means, but Ukraine has our ironclad support, and at the same time saying, but obviously we're not going to send any troops there. So I describe it actually in my book a little bit. The Biden administration's approach to this was schizophrenic, because it was also vis-a-vis the Ukrainians. Because on one hand, the Biden administration was revealing all this intelligence that really showed that an invasion was being planned and was about to be carried out. And so the Ukrainians didn't know what to do, because the Ukrainians said, well, if you're so sure about this, then give us some serious weapons, right? And that's why I say it was schizophrenic. Of course, the Biden administration, I think, the Biden administration had other considerations. Of course, I mean, the ultimate consideration is avoiding a conflict with Russia that could escalate into a nuclear war. I think this is sometimes overlooked in Ukraine, that this is sort of, for American leaders, is sort of the ultimate goal to avoid that. So, as far as Putin's demands, because he did want to change the whole post-Cold War order in Europe. He wanted the U.S. and NATO to basically remove any infrastructure they had in eastern Ukraine. I think it was it goes back to this idea of revenge or humiliation, because of course the revenge is not only against Ukrainians, it's against the West, or as the Russians like to say, the collective West, right? There's this long, ever-growing snowball of grievances, of Russian grievances. I should really say, though, grievances of a certain generation against the West. And so this was sort of all exploding. The famous Munich speech that Putin gave in 2007, this was now finally sort of the end of it. Okay, well, I told you back in 2007 what I thought about you guys, and now this is now I'm going to tell you what's going to happen. And I think when we look back at it, at this decision to invade, it seems very irrational. Why did he do it? And if we look at Russian propaganda, state propaganda said they were making fun of the Americans. Saying the Americans are warmongers. Why are the Americans saying all these terrible things that we're going to do? This isn't going to happen, right? This is typical American saber rattling. And so even the propagandists were surprised that this invasion actually happened in the end. So it was kind of this outpouring of rage at the end for all of these perceived slights, going back to Kosovo, the recognition of Kosovo's independence, the U.S. decision to go to war in Iraq without listening to the Russians' opinion, etc. So I think that was certainly certainly part of it. I don't know if I answered your question, Eric.
Very much. Thank you.
All right, thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
Thank you. My name is Anton. I'm the debt investor of Moldova, US. Thank you for your presentation. My question would be a question and then a comment.
Excuse me, a little louder. We can't hear.
So you said you mentioned that you described in the book a bit about Georgia and about Ukraine. So my question would be if you have ever touched about Moldova. That's my question, and the comment would be from my part. During the Revolution of Dignity, I worked in the embassy of Moldova to Ukraine, and afterwards I was posted to Brussels. And now what is happening in Moldova, maybe not everyone knows, but Russia has cut the gas, and the region Transnistria now is without gas, and they stay without energy, heat, and sometimes water. That's why when I heard about, you sent the email on Saturday, and when I heard about revenge, I made the connection with what is happening now in Moldova. So our understanding and our point of view is, or our readout is that what is happening in Moldova is connected to the bigger plan of Russia towards Ukraine. So the interest of Russia is to destabilize Ukraine, and we have concrete thoughts on this related to the elections and the referendum that took place last year. So I will just give some numbers that Russia has poured illegally into Moldova 39 million euros only in the month of September and October. Just as a comparison, US gave us assistance last year in an amount of $50 million. Just a small comparison into this sense. So everything now that is happening, this is a chain of events, and as my takeaway, my personal thing about what happened from the Revolution of Dignity onwards, okay, there are a lot of things going on, but it started with the decision of Yanukovych not to sign or to initial the association agreement and of Vilnius summit. Then it was 1st of December when the students were beaten first time, and then we got to the bloody things on 17th of February when 100 people were killed on Maidan. So and after that it came the taking of Crimea, then there were the elections, so things in this sense. That was my takeaway when I was in Kiev. Afterwards I went into Brussels, and my interest was towards Eastern Partnership. My personal view about Eastern Partnership, that was a certain of agreement not to disturb Russia and not to allow us to go further. Now we are at the point where in Georgia is happening what is happening. We with Ukraine are on the path of EU accession. So clearly Ukraine also has the NATO component. In our case, we still have put in the constitution that we have neutrality stuff. But the idea is that now the interest towards Moldova and of course towards Ukraine is to detour what is or our path forward towards going to the European Union. And in my personal point of view, I see this as a chain of events that is coming, and this is more part of the big picture of Russian intent towards the region, towards specifically Moldova. Yeah, sorry for this comment, but my question was related if you touched something about Moldova in your analysis.
Thanks for coming, Anton. Nice to see you again. So I will be honest. This book goes up to the day of the full-scale invasion, and up to this point in the story of Ukraine and Russia, Moldova didn't play such a huge role. So I don't dwell on Moldova's dilemmas, and I think what we do see since the full-scale invasion is that Moldova has become much more important in the eyes of policymakers, and I think even Moldovans themselves are much more aware now of how vulnerable they are, right, because of the invasion of Ukraine. One thing I wanted to touch on, because you mentioned the Eastern Partnership, which was the EU's outreach. I think you described it quite well, but yeah, I mean, it was outreach to Eastern European countries like Ukraine, like Moldova, that wanted to join the EU, but the EU had no interest in letting in. And I think I mentioned that NATO had no interest in letting Ukraine into the alliance. But the same thing applies to the European Union, and the European Union, of course, also carries responsibility for raising all these hopes among Ukrainians that, you know, Ukrainians were probably the first people to die with EU flags in their hands on the Maidan, and the European Union was. This was the Maidan protest was about an association agreement, not even about membership. And I think for the Europeans, it was sort of also a very secondary issue. And what I also go into in a little bit is the European Union failing to see how they were perceived in Russia, in the Kremlin. The European Union won the Nobel Peace Prize, had won the Nobel Peace Prize before that. They saw themselves as a peaceful union, ever expanding prosperity for all in a very sort of naive way. And from the Kremlin's point of view, this was a Western project to, again, expand closer and closer to Russia's borders, with the goal of ultimately changing the regime in Russia. So this very sort of innocent union of European nations ended up turning into a real geopolitical player, and I think that's also one of the interesting results. Just as Moldova's new profile is also that the European Union now has to decide, are they going to get their act together? Are they going to become a player in their own right that can stand up not only to Russia but to the United States?
All right. Yes, please.
Hi, I'm Sharon Kotak, and I have a question about, do you believe or do you think that had the Biden administration given Ukraine all the weapons it needed and also allowed Ukraine to say, okay, you can use the weapons wherever, even if you have to go into Russia, that Ukraine could have won?
Are you referring to the beginning of the war, or what happened once the invasion began?
Once the invasion began.
Well, this is of course the question that nobody can answer.
That's true, yeah.
The friends of Ukrainians and Ukrainians themselves obviously will tell you that, well, the Biden administration dithered so long, and they finally gave us permission on all these different weapon systems, and if only they had done it earlier, it would have changed balance of power, or the balance of forces on the battlefield. I don't really want to weigh in on that, because I really see that it's a very delicate, when we're talking about the questions of escalation, it's a very delicate issue. So in hindsight, what's called kind of the salami tactic of giving permission, cutting the salami very, very thin, or boiling the frog very slowly, these kind of things are less provocative than just, telling the Ukrainians, here are the F-16s. Of course, there was also the practical issue that there were no Ukrainian pilots that could fly F-16s, for example. So I'm a little bit skeptical about that, and we know that Putin was considering the use of maybe a tactical nuclear weapon when things were going badly in October 2022, when the initial invasion had failed, and the Ukrainians were launching a major counteroffensive that removed Russians from a large portions of, for example, Kharkov region. So I don't want to pretend like I know that there are very strong political views on this, but I try to analyze things the way that they are, and I think it's impossible to say.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Mike Parks, Elliott School and George Washington alumni. I had two questions. The first is I was wondering if the Russian experience in Chechnya influenced how Putin maybe sees Ukraine or Russia's place in the world, Ukraine role vis-a-vis Russia. The second is I've noticed in Western both policy and academic circles, a lot of the discourse seems to assume that the conflict started in 2022, completely ignoring the annexation of Crimea and even like the Orange Revolution. I was wondering why you thought that was. Thanks.
Okay, so the first question was about Chechnya.
Yes.
Well, I think when we see the pictures of devastated cities in eastern Ukraine, what comes to mind are the pictures of Grozny after the second Chechen campaign. So I think many people, and I would probably consider myself among them, when viewing Putin's Russia, we tended not to think that much about Chechnya, and I think people who are a little bit more far-sighted realize that Chechnya in some ways was a kind of the original sin of post-communist Russia, right? This was a devastating war that killed countless people and destroyed Chechnya. And that this in some ways, and it was of course also accompanied Putin's rise to power. So as far as Vladimir Putin is concerned, it also had certain lessons, and certain lessons of how to wage war, which again we saw in Syria, or maybe that's the wrong word I used, see, because again, we didn't really see what was going on in Syria. I was in Russia during that time. We usually just saw, you know, pictures of precision airstrikes and things like that, but a lot of the devastation is hidden from us, what Russia did in Syria as well. So I do think that's an important precedent. As to your question of why people see 2022 as the beginning of this conflict, I don't know. I find it a little bit peculiar myself, and I myself find it a little bit annoying when people say the war started in 2022. Of course it didn't start in 2022, it started in 2014. This was obviously a huge escalation, and as I mentioned before, the mystery that is still, could this have happened in 2014? I'm actually dubious if this was, Putin was not ready in 2014 to do this, right? And partially I argue that in 2014, Putin actually got a lot of what he wanted. First of all, he got Crimea, which from a Russian point of view made sense because it's the home of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. It's a strategically important place. It projects Russian power much further west into the Black Sea. And that was a very successful military operation. It was almost bloodless. There was punishment in the form of sanctions, but nothing that the Russian economy couldn't swallow. So that was a success. And so he got what he wanted. Plus, in eastern Ukraine, you had these two very strange proxy statelets that had emerged, and an unresolved low-level war. But with those conditions, one territory occupied by Russia, the other, then two territories in a conflict with Russia, he had crippled Ukraine's chances of getting into NATO ever. You know, mission accomplished if you want to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. I think that gets overlooked a lot. And that's why I don't find a lot of these reasons very convincing that NATO somehow forced Putin's hand. Putin effectively stopped NATO's eastward enlargement into the former Soviet Union in 2008 with the Georgia War. The first and last time that any former Soviet republics joined NATO was in 2004 when Estonia, Lithuania, and Latvia joined. And of course this annoyed Putin greatly, but there was always a feeling inside Russia that the Baltic nations were maybe a little bit different anyway, but Ukraine, it was something different because it was part of the heartland, which many Russians had already identified as sort of the heartland of the Russian Empire.
Okay. Yes.
Hi, Bill Hill, currently with the Kennan Institute. I'd like to put a question, putting this in a really broader historical context, both of the former Soviet Union and going back to Soviet times. You know, as the Soviet Union, since the Soviet Union fell apart, U.S. policy has had two major goals. One is which is to maintain a relationship with Russia that furthers certain interests of strategic stability, in particular control over various nuclear issues, not just arms control, but nuclear weapons, but nuclear materials. And at the same time, the U.S. has wished to support the independent sovereignty and free development of the 14 independent countries of the Soviet Union that were not Russia. You juxtapose it with this, and you can go back to the beginning of the Yeltsin administration, making a very good argument that Russia never, the Soviet Union fell apart, but Russia never left in terms of intent and desire, never left the position of trying to maintain predominant influence in all of these republics, of which Ukraine is probably one of the two biggest and most important. And so how does how can the U.S., or what is the prospect now of the U.S. balancing a relationship with Russia, if one is possible or ever going to, whenever it's going to be possible again, with a support for the independence and sovereignty of states like Ukraine, which are much closer and much more subject to the interference and manipulation, either to military pressure or hybrid pressure from a nuclear power with whom we in Washington ultimately will not go to war. And I mean, this predates the demise of the Soviet Union. Hungary in 1956, Czechoslovakia in 1968, Poland in 1981, where we were supportive of the desires of the people, yet unwilling to get into a position where it would result in a kinetic conflict with Russia. The final thing, Georgia. There's a wonderful interview that Steve Hadley gave to the BBC several years later, talking about what we, the United States, discussed in August of 2008 as Russian forces were going into Georgia, and the mood was militant, to take action against Russia. And Hadley himself recalled, until he raised the point that if we were going to do some of this, it would require American boots on the ground, at which point the desire of Washington to get directly involved in that sense. It strikes me that your book documents this essential contradiction in the sense of U.S. support for Ukrainian independence and sovereignty, but yet a combination of a desire for a relationship with Russia plus an unwillingness to take action in support of the independence of countries like Ukraine if it results in too great a risk of open conflict that might possibly escalate into nuclear war. Now that we're where we are, how do we deal with that in the future?
You're about 2 minutes left.
You can solve that in 2 minutes, I'm sure.
Well, I mean, I do think that's an essential contradiction that we've seen throughout Russia, the U.S. Supporting independence of former Soviet republics and its relationship with Russia. I mean, as a reporter, I was on 2 trips. One with Hillary Clinton when she was Secretary of State, and with Joe Biden when he was Vice President. Intended through Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan, and Ukraine. Always these trips to sort of reassure people after some big move in Russian-American relations. And I think that contradiction is going to remain. Although, I mean, look, if we look at the incoming administration, I really think we're. Let me step back. The Biden administration was really, in many ways, forced to support Ukraine. It was not like they wanted to, but they realized this is what we have to do. It was not this was not how Joe Biden came into office thinking he was going to embrace Volodymyr Zelensky. It was really the last thing he wanted. He wanted to establish sort of a floor in declining relations with Russia and sort of reach an agreement with Putin that he wouldn't be his spoiler, right? And now I think with Donald Trump coming into office, I think we're going to see really the pendulum swing the other way, where the primacy of Russian-American relations will again be much more important, and U.S. relations to other former Soviet countries is going to take a back seat to that relationship. I mean, that's how I would certainly see it, viewing Trump's first administration and the things that the Trump people have been saying coming into office.
Okay, and I'm afraid we're out of time. We have some time, I guess, for informal discussion. Just before thanking our speaker, I just wanted to again mention if there are any students who are here who would like to enter the lottery for a free copy of the book, it's right here. Just make sure you contact me. I don't know if there are any that aren't. Yeah, there's one, another up here. We'll draw it right after thanking our author. So thanks again, Lucian. This is really fantastic. Thank you.